Welcome to episode 3. Today we're talking about the engine swap. When I first bought the car, it didn't actually come with an engine, it was just the shell and a few of the panels. So I had to choose an engine, and being a Subaru fan, you know I've got the WRX. I was thinking EJ207 would be the way to go, but those engines are pretty expensive and they can be even more expensive if you want to make them reliable. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the engine. I'm not a mechanic. The reason the Honda is a good engine, so I believe, is the ability to breathe a lot of air through the really well-designed cylinder head. They seem to make a lot of power from very little boost because of that, and they just seem to be a good, reliable engine that's affordable and easy to get. What I will talk about is some of the accessories, or things like the turbo manifold, the size of the turbo. I'll talk a bit about the dry sump, the air intake, and then I'll also talk a bit about the fabrication of the custom parts that I've added to the engine. Like, it's got a custom made valve cover and the dry sump system. I've made my own oil pan for the dry sump and also the bracket that attaches the pump to the engine. I can't talk about the engine without mentioning the transmission. What I ended up running with is a BMW ZF 5-speed. I believe these come out of a E36, E46, Z4 and maybe some others. I don't really know much about BMWs, but I needed something that was not too heavy and could handle a decent amount of power. So in Australia there isn't really a lot of options, and this one basically ticked all the boxes for me. Well, what I would like to run in the future is a paddle shifted sequential transmission, but this will do quite nicely for now. It's very compact, it's lightweight, can handle good power, and I was able to get a off-the-shelf adapter plate to mate the transmission to the Honda K24 engine, and also I was able to buy the flywheel and clutch as well from PMC Motorsport. Starting with the dry sump, so most people think a dry sump is going to be really expensive, but that's only the case when you buy a complete off-the-shelf kit. I was able to get this dry sump system going by choosing the parts myself and then making some of the parts to save a bit of money. You can see here we've got the oil pump. Now, the bracket that attaches the oil pump to the engine block, I actually made that myself. The only parts I bought were the pump and the pulley wheel on the front of the engine, and also there's a small fitting for the oil coming back into the block. This is that fitting for the dry sump, so it replaces your factory oil filter here and allows you to have an oil line going directly into the block. So buying the pump separate and not as a complete kit, it was actually quite inexpensive. And then I've bought a separate dry sump oil tank. Now, of course, the oil lines are going to cost a bit of money, but I'm going to put those together myself as well. So I'm going to go through the process now of fabricating the bracket to mount the oil pump. It's actually a 6mm thick steel plate, and it was really just a matter of looking at the guidelines for how the oil pump should be mounted and the tension in the belt, and then just keeping everything square and building a pretty basic bracket that's held on by 2 bolts. The oil pan is actually the factory oil pan, the K24 steel oil pan. And what I did to make into a dry sump pan is I cut the bottom off and then welded on a flat plate with a little bit of box section at the bottom, which is going to capture the oil. And then we've got a couple of fittings which are welded onto the side of that box section. So those fittings will take the oil from the pan and then feed that into the pump over here. There's clearance cut out just for the front cross member. So I've mounted the engine as low as possible, which is again for center of gravity, that's the way you want it. The oil pan has a kind of a baffle or windage tray built into the bottom, so the oil can drop into the lower box section and then get sucked out through the fittings. The fittings themselves have a fine mesh to stop generally any larger pieces of, say you had an engine failure, that would stop the metallic particles making their way into the dry sump oil pump. The turbo is a Borg-Warner EFR 9174, so it's the twin scroll with the internal wastegate. Choosing the turbo, again, I'm not an expert, so I did talk with somebody who is quite knowledgeable in the field. I spoke a lot with Jeff from Full Race Motorsports, and there was a lot of back and forth emails, and in the end I decided to go with this turbo based on his advice to make upwards of, say, 800 horsepower. You'll notice that we've got a electronic actuator for the wastegate, which is a pretty new system to the market. It uses a Civic Type R electronic wastegate actuator, so an OEM style actuator. This system was used quite successfully heavily on the Pikes Peak car that won a few times, Robin Schute's car. So I figured that was a nice way to go, to have a very compact system. The aluminium core makes the turbo exceptionally lightweight and of course quite compact with the internal wastegate. You don't need to attach external wastegates, and you would need 2 external wastegates in the twin scroll scenario. Just thought I'd show you the weight of the turbo manifold, including the turbo, before I put it onto the engine. So you can see it only weighs 17.8 kilo or 39 pounds. So yeah, you can see the turbo is pretty big. I actually ended up having to relocate part of the pushrod suspension to make this turbo fit. So before, the actual coilover was vertical and now it's horizontal, just to make room for this turbo. There's going to need to be some good heat management for the turbo, and I will duct some fresh air, some cold fresh air onto the electronic actuator to make sure that doesn't get too hot. So I was dead set on having the turbo low mounted, so I couldn't buy a off-the-shelf turbo manifold, and I like to make things myself anyway, so making the turbo manifold was a really big job. I don't know if I'd want to do it again. It took a lot of work, but it was made more difficult by the fact that the engine, well, the engine bay and the clearance around the turbo was pretty minimal, so I wasn't working with a lot of room to get the turbo in a low mount position. So I had to build a jig that would locate the turbo in the exact position it was going to be in. I think there was only 10 millimeters clearance either side around the turbo. So by making a jig, I knew that the turbo would be in the exact same position once I'd finished making everything, and that enabled me to basically take it all off, put it on the bench and start building the turbo inside the jig. And I didn't really have any other clearance issues above the turbo, so it's a twin scroll design, so you have to get the correct firing order, and then because it's an internal wastegate, it was a bit simplified, but made more complicated by the fact that all the tubes were very close to each other, and I hadn't really made turbo manifold before. So yeah, it was really hard work, but it turned out pretty good in the end. The process of making the manifold was just basically getting one runner at a time fitted to the collector. I'm using a hypertune cast collector, which certainly made the process of fabricating everything a lot more simple. Make one runner at a time until you've got all 4 runners made, and then you have to break apart break each runner off the manifold, and then because it's stainless steel, it needs to be welded with argon purging on the inside of the tube and obviously through your TIG torch. So each runner is welded separately and then strategically put back on between the collector and the head flange in a specific order, so you can weld them all the way around. And I will say the last weld on the inside of the collector was incredibly tricky, trying to get in there with the TIG torch. So I'll talk a bit now about this custom valve cover that I made. The factory valve cover, sure, it's fine, it does the job. It's a little bit ugly, and I'd seen these sort of flat valve covers that I think it's Honda HPD make them. You see them on a lot of the race cars, so it's got that more motorsport look about it, a little bit unique, and I thought, okay, well, I could probably make something like that. And I ended up going ahead and cutting the top off the factory valve cover, and actually it was the first time I'd welded aluminium, so I was jumping in the deep end a bit there, but everything had to be, all the welds had to be smoothed out, so it wasn't a big deal to get the look. So yeah, I cut the top off the valve cover and just made a flat plate that would receive all the coil packs, and it was just a matter of making up the little pieces, and I just copied the design off the Honda HPD valve cover. You'll notice there's no dipstick and there's no oil fill, because with the dry sump you don't need those things. So yeah, I just thought that gives the engine that sort of that motorsport look, and it looks pretty cool. So not something I needed to do, but something I wanted to do. Can't not talk about the Prackworks carbon intake. This thing is just so good looking, like bit of a splash out. Spent a fair bit of money on it. Didn't really need to spend that much money on an air intake, but man, this thing is just, I mean, you got to see this thing in the flesh. Is just beautiful. Like, and honestly, for what they cost and the amount of work that must go into making them, I think they're worth every cent, to be honest. So originally I had a K-Power Industries front, so throttle body mounted to the front, and that was fine, but I was having a bit of clearance issues with the ducting that I want to do. So my radiator and my intercooler are going to be fully ducted in and then out and back out through the bonnet. And yeah, I was having a bit of clearance with the ducting and the throttle body, so I kind of wanted to go to the center feed, not just for that clearance issue, but so that gave me more space at the front of the intake manifold, but also I just think having the air coming in like evenly like this is better. You're just going to get more even airflow to each cylinder. I've got this really nice starter motor. I mean, it's hard to get excited over a starter motor, but this thing is just beautiful. It's all custom made in the UK by Breeze, so it's specifically for the K series. It's much higher power and much lighter weight, and another benefit too is it doesn't have this huge shroud on the back, which meant I didn't have to take a big notch out of my manual transmission to clear the big shroud that's usually on the starter motor. So yeah, it's a really nice piece from Carwood Breeze in the UK. Continuing on with the electrical system, I'm going to need a bigger alternator than this one. This is kind of what I've realized is I've got too many electricity hungry accessories on the car now. So I've got the electronic throttle body, I've got the electric water pump, and I've also got the electronic wastegate. So yeah, this alternator is going to need to be upgraded to a bigger one. You can see I'm using the Track Tough adapter plate here, so we've got rid of the factory water pump and I'm using an electric water pump. I'll do a separate episode on all the different cooling parts of the engine because I've got some pretty interesting things going on with the cooling system. Swirl pots and things like that, so we'll talk about that in a separate episode. But speaking of Track Tough, so I've got this nice adapter on the back here that is really good for a rear-wheel drive application where your water is coming out the back of the engine. You don't want it to be coming straight out the back when you've got a rear-wheel drive because it'd be hard up against the firewall. I've also got this blank off plate here as well because I'm using the electric water pump. I've gone with the Prackworks fuel rail there, which is an option you can select when you're buying the intake manifold. Fits really nicely and obviously, you know, it's all well integrated. And I guess the last thing I can talk about is the electronic throttle body. So I'm just running, it's a Bosch, I think it's 74mm electronic throttle body. Well, that brings me to the end of episode 3. If you haven't seen episodes 1 and 2, please check them out. Episode 1 is all about the rear suspension. Episode 2 is about the front suspension. If you have any questions about the engine swap, leave them in the comments below. And I hope you all enjoyed the video.